Welcome, everyone. I am Pam Ryan. I am your facilitator, and it is my pleasure to introduce the District of North Vancouver staff who are here today to provide information and answer questions about the new provincial housing initiatives. Dan Milburn, General Manager of Planning, Permits, and Properties, has a prepared presentation and will be available to answer your questions. Andy Bell, Section Manager, Provincial Housing Initiatives Project Office, and Peter Cohen, Director of Engineering Services, will also be available to respond to your questions. You will also hear from my co-moderator, Kirsty Dick, who will be helping me with the question moderation when we get to that portion of the session. And my colleague, Josh Michelson, is providing technical support. So if you're receiving technical support, that will probably be Josh that is helping you. As we begin, I want to be clear that this discussion and your input today will inform recommendations to Council and the new zoning bylaws that are set to be adopted in June. For today's session, we will not be able to answer questions about specific district lots. Please be advised that the information and visuals in this presentation are provided for illustrative purposes only and should not be used for legal or any other purposes that require precise accuracy. The information is subject to change and may not be fully complete. I will now hand things over to Dan for a brief presentation to provide some context and maybe even answer some of your questions. And for this reason, I encourage you to hold your questions until Dan finishes presentation and we move into the Q&A portion. Dan, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so very much. Again, Dan Milburn with the District North Vancouver. Been working with the district for the last 9 years. Just wanted to do a sound check and visual check. Everyone, if the moderator can just confirm, we've got the presentation up and folks can hear me?
Yeah, you're doing great.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, so I'll be speaking as brief as possible. This is quite a complex project, and it's an evolving issue for communities. And I'll be covering a fair bit of territory in terms of legislative changes. This is, in fact, one of the most significant changes in land use and planning that we've seen, certainly in my career in 25 years, and certainly for many, many decades in the province of British Columbia. So I'll just clarify one point. The significant legislative changes are at the provincial level, and local governments essentially derive all their power from the province through legislation such as the Local Government Act and Community Charter. So we're really, some people say we're creatures of the province in that sense. But as legislative created entities, that creates a council and that creates a governing body to provide services, to be stewards of infrastructure, to also ensure the well-being and health of residents, and generally provide good governance for the community. So recently, in the last couple of years, the province has decided that significant changes are needed on land use and planning in response to what's been described as sort of a crisis in housing. And the provincial government has said that they would like to make changes in order to speed up the approval of housing in communities. And they feel changes are needed to the legislation, and changes are needed in terms of the permitted land use and density in communities across British Columbia in order to achieve that. So I'm not a spokesman here for the province, but I'm just relaying their words. They have made many, many changes. I'm not going to have time to cover all of them today. I'm going to be focusing on those that we really need to ensure are communicated to the community, communicated to council, so that we can provide good advice and our council can make important decisions by June 30th of this year. So if you've heard some of the recent changes to the Short-Term Rentals or Residential Tenancy Act, or even Bill 16 recently announced last week, I won't be getting into detail on those particular changes. And instead, I'll be really focusing the balance of the presentation, and really the kind of the back half actually is really focused on what's called small scale multi-unit housing and transit-oriented areas. That will be the focus. But to begin with, I'm going to introduce some important changes that are affecting the district as well. So, and our role here as staff is to hear your feedback, make sure that's communicated to council, give advice to council so that bylaws can be adjusted as required by the province. Okay. As was mentioned previously, the last little bit of introductory comment I'll mention here is this exercise isn't a kind of lot by lot assessment of what is the highest and best use for that property. We don't have time for such an assessment. We're really talking about high-level policy decisions and bylaw decisions in response to the provincial legislation. All right. First of all, just a little bit of context for the District of North Vancouver. As many of you are residents, you know this history. The district has developed over 100 years in terms of becoming really an important urban center amongst the North Shore. And we have an official community plan that's been in place since 2011, which really calls for increased density and focus of growth in the town and village centers, and in particular, 4 key growth centers. That's Lionsgate in the west, and then Lynn Valley, Lynn Creek, and Maplewood, as shown on the map, connected by transit corridors and transportation corridors shown in red. At the time when this plan was developed with tremendous consultation with the community, it was anticipated that the demand from 2011 to 2030 would be around 10,000 net new housing units. And we've been working and responding to applications and developments since that time. And we're about 65% of the way there in terms of council's approvals toward that estimated demand. So the rate of change in the community is based on a number of factors, not just the regulatory approvals of the district, but also regulatory approvals of private utilities such as BC Hydro and Fortis, as well as provincial approvals and other regulatory standards. In addition, the rate of development is impacted by infrastructure. In certain areas, increased amounts of infrastructure are needed in order to develop, and that has a cost, and that has a process attached to it. Another is environmental or physical limitations. So environmentally sensitive areas, hazards, all those things can impact rate of change. Services provided in the community, such as hospitals and schools, obviously should have some guidance on the rate of change. And we need to respond to those issues, or the agencies responsible for those services need to respond to growth. Ownership and tenure. Who owns the land? Is it owned by a speculator? Is it owned by a homeowner? All of that determines how quickly change happens in the community. And then, of course, market factors. And many folks have heard a lot about interest rates, challenges with labor supply and supply chain. All of those things come into play when thinking about the rate of change in the community. So the provincial legislative agenda recently, and the ones I'm going to be speaking about today, are really focused on changes to the regulatory environment and the land use and density permitted in communities across British Columbia. So we're not alone in this. This is affecting communities across BC. I'll first mention the Housing Supply Act. This is one that was introduced in the spring of last year. The minister, Ravi Kahlon, Minister of Housing, provided the district with a housing target order in the fall, so it took in effect October, and set out essentially a provincial order requiring the district to approve a certain number of units within the next 5 years. What that looked like for the communities that the order took effect on, and it was actually 10 communities across British Columbia. They're listed here. This is just an excerpt from CBC showing how the change would affect those first 10 communities that were subject to the provincial order. And I've highlighted in black the District of North Vancouver, and in green you see 3,559 units. That's about the number of housing starts we had in the last 5 years. And the housing target order given to us in October was that the District of North Vancouver needed to see the completion of 2,838 units in the coming 5 years. So we can see that's certainly within the range of possibility, given the amount of approvals that we've had in the past and the anticipated demand that we know is there for the future. Other communities have different amounts of targets, and Vancouver, of course, at the top of the list being the top. So the province also introduced significant changes to how consultation occurs with residential developments. And this change actually took effect at the end of November of last year, so it's in effect now. And public hearings are prohibited for residential developments since that time. So before, the district would use public hearings as a means to engage the community and allow residents to speak directly to their council members in council chambers in sort of a structured format to hear from everyone who had an interest in the application. They weren't a requirement unless there was also an official community plan amendment at the same time as the rezoning bylaw related to the public hearing. But it was generally, it was optional for council. And in the district, we typically held public hearings. Since the end of November, public hearings under provincial law must not be held if the sole purpose of the rezoning is for residential development, or if it's a mixed-use project with at least 50% of the floor area being for residential use. So that's a significant change from what we're used to in the district. Public hearings may still be held for other types of zoning bylaw amendments, such as if it's a rezoning for commercial use or industrial use, or where there's an official community plan amendment. Next, I'd like to speak about significant changes that also occurred at the end of November, but they have a staggered timeline for implementation. And those include updates to our housing needs report, which is really a report defining what our future housing needs are. We have one in place right now. The last one was adopted by council in July of last year, and it identifies our growth needs as defined by the district council for the coming 5 years. Additionally, the province has indicated official community plans and zoning bylaws must also be updated to reflect that need. And I'll just describe that a little bit more so folks understand. So before, and as I mentioned, we have a housing needs report. It looked out 5 years into the future and looked at our housing need. The province is going to be publishing standards and requiring local governments across British Columbia to have housing needs reports now projecting out 20 years of growth, okay? Well, that's not that unusual. Our official community plan, when it was created in 2011, it looked out 20 years. So we're used to that kind of time scale. But it gets a little more important. I'll mention that in a moment. So if we look out 20 years into the future, and that housing needs report has to be updated by the end of the year, we also need to update the community's official community plan by the end of 2025. And it likewise has to have designated lands out for the next 20 years of anticipated growth. And the zoning in the community at the same time needs to change to also accommodate 20 years of capacity of growth at the end of 2025, okay? So extending out from 2025 for 20 years. That is really a really big change. We're more commonly used to, certainly in the district of North Vancouver, about 95% of developments require a rezoning process with a public hearing and all those, the trappings of process and review. In the future, there'll be significantly fewer rezonings, and really the focus will necessarily need to be on the official community plan update and the zoning changes that occur at that time. I'll just move on to the next. And again, this is really the focus of today's conversation is those small scale multi-unit housing and trans-oriented areas. The reason being, bylaws need to be in place by June 30th, 2024. So this is an important conversation for us at the district and communities across British Columbia. So small scale multi-unit housing, that's the acronym SSMUH. Some folks refer to it as SMU. I know it's not a great acronym, but I'll say SMU for the purpose of brevity. What this is essentially taking or defining traditional single family and duplex neighborhoods and saying that zoning is no longer applicable. And instead, it will be replaced with, this is what the province is asking to be done in all communities in British Columbia over 5,000, so urban communities over 5,000, that traditional single-family zones will be replaced with small-scale multi-unit housing zones that accommodate either 3, 4, or 6 units, okay? Additionally, as I said, that needs to be in place by June 30th. Additionally, for the 6 unit sites, there will be no parking requirement, okay? So the difference between 3, 4, and 6, I'll just mention briefly, is if the property is around 3,000 square feet in area. So if it's approximately 3,000 square foot lot, then, or larger, then 4 units must be permitted by zoning, according to the provincial legislation. And if it's over that 3,000 square foot lot and within proximity to frequent transit, and I'll show you a map of those areas in a moment, then 6 units must be permitted according to the province. One thing I will mention is the district has actually had a fairly progressive infill strategy for many years. We've allowed secondary suites since the 1990s. More recently, we permitted expanded secondary suites and also coach houses and also small lot infill opportunities. So we have definitely had an interest in infill opportunities in the community. And the province is essentially moving this really a step farther in terms of density permission. So here are some examples of 4 and 6 unit buildings that the province identifies as potential look and feel that you could see change over time. And I think what's important is if the zoning changes in a single family neighborhood, that doesn't mean that all the properties, get redeveloped overnight. Obviously, it would take time. The province anticipates that across British Columbia, there would be about 130,000 additional housing units created as a result of the application of small-scale multi-unit housing. So in terms of that aesthetic, we need to come up with not just identifying where this would apply in the district, but also what the regulations would be. And the province has provided a policy guideline on the kinds of zones that need to be created. And so for the 4 to 6 unit sites, it calls for an increase in height to allow about 3 stories, close to 11 meters in height is what the province is suggesting, that we look closely at the gross floor area and increase that area in order to accommodate 4 to 6 units on the sites where it's allowed. And then we understand that it's important that we look at partial or no basements as an option to be considered as part of this in order to reduce the impact on groundwater, the environment, and also lift those units out of the ground so they're more livable. We also want to look at access, so flanking streets and lanes and how these lots could be impacted by that, as well as ensuring that we have flexibility for the future so that we can have adaptable housing that can grow and change over time. So, as I mentioned, the idea is to convert traditional single-family neighborhoods into neighborhoods that could accommodate 4 to 6 units in many circumstances. The province, though, acknowledged there are some areas where that kind of density wouldn't be appropriate. So I'll just go through these quickly. Land outside of our urban containment boundary. So up in the alpine lots in the forested lands above our urban containment boundary, the province has indicated that would not be appropriate for small-scale multi-unit housing. Lands that are already protected for heritage conservation reasons would not be subject to small-scale multi-unit housing. Land not currently connected to water or sewer. Another, large lots. Lots that are over an acre, small-scale multi-unit housing wouldn't apply to, and then certain hazardous conditions. And I'll talk about that a little further in a subsequent slide. So as we look at the issue of hazardous conditions and how an increase or incremental increase in density might create a concern for a community is we're subject to many hazards in the District North Vancouver. We know that, we've identified that through years of analysis and research, and we have identified sites where there are concerns. There's concerns in terms of creek hazards, so flooding. There's concerns in terms of slope hazards, so land movement, and also with wildfire. And there's many others, but here are some of the ones that I think most directly impact small-scale multi-unit housing, and they're shown on this map. So we've looked at those areas and identified that we think it would be appropriate to exempt the areas shown in this map that are currently single-family from small-scale multi-unit housing because they are subject to increased risk associated with the increased density, and it can't be effectively mitigated at this time. Now, that's really just a snapshot in time. Of course, hazards change over time, and we recognize that. And we recognize, therefore, that as we learn more about hazards, those exempt areas may need to grow or shrink based on our understanding of those hazards. Here's what we know, though, right now, is that, and I'll just describe these colors very briefly. The orange areas, again, are those exempt areas where we think that, they aren't serviced, they're subject to hazards and so on. We are identifying those as the province requires, and they're shown in orange on this map. We also show in this map single-family or traditional single-family neighborhoods where it appears, based on the lot size, that small-scale multi-unit housing up to 4 units appears to be able to be accommodated under the requirements of the province. Again, those are shown in yellow. Okay, that's a significant number of lots. That's around a little over 10,000 existing lots in the District of North Vancouver. Next, in red are the areas that appear to be able to accommodate, subject, to the provincial rules, up to 6 units. Okay, so these are traditional single-family neighborhoods where 6-unit small-scale multi-unit housing could be applied, or based on the provincial rules. So now I'm just going to describe a little, in the next slide, a little bit of analysis that we've done. So we've taken this information and we've tried to understand, can these areas be readily serviced? They were originally developed as single-family neighborhoods. So we wanted to get to the bottom of that, and we've done some preliminary research. So the preliminary research has identified that we do have, within those small-scale multi-unit housing areas, some areas where servicing is likely more feasible. It's not a 100% guarantee. There likely will be some service improvements needed, but it's likely more feasible given the existing infrastructure in place. So those areas are shown in green. Okay, so that's the Norgate Pemberton areas near just west of Lynn Valley and surrounding the Lynn Valley Town Center, and then the Keith Lynn area, all shown on the map in green. Next is areas that we've preliminarily identified where servicing is really likely more challenging. It's going to be harder to service these areas, and they're shown in that light blue color. And that's because the water and sanitary services might be somewhat constrained. And if you were to add in many of these small-scale multifamily housing units, or in some cases only a few, you would likely reach some thresholds in terms of servicing availability. And so we're particularly concerned and interested in those areas and how we can address that. All right, shifting gears now to the transit-oriented areas. This is another piece of legislation the province has put into place where we need to act and respond with a bylaw change by June 30th of this year. And what the province has done is they've identified across the province areas where increased height and density must be permitted on lands identified for residential use in proximity to certain transit stops, bus exchanges, and so on. Now, how this affects the District of North Vancouver is 2 sites have been identified by the province. One is Phibbs Exchange in Lynn Creek, and the other is the Capilano University. Those 2 sites were identified by the province as transit-oriented areas in legislation. And what that means is, if we draw a circle around the sites the province identified, and that circle is a 200-meter radius to it, within that area, if a residential use is permitted and there's no other exemption, then an FSR or allowable floor area must be 4 and allowable height must be 12. For areas, if we draw a circle that has a 400-meter radius, so a larger circle around those same points, Phibbs Exchange and Capilano University, within that area, we must allow up to an FSR of 3, and that translates to about an 8-story building. So a 12 and 8-story building must be permitted. I'll also note the province has said that local governments can't set parking standards in these areas. So we aren't able to require parking for these developments. Developers may voluntarily provide parking, but the district wouldn't be able to require it. So what that looks like in terms of the District of North Vancouver is, on the left is a map of those 2 circles, the 200 meter shown in red and the 400 meter shown in orange, circling the Phibbs Exchange that the province identified. And what we've done is looked at all the parcels within those circles that where residential use is permitted, and where we anticipate that 12-story and 4 FSR must be allowed, and that's shown in those lots colored red. And then the lots colored orange, those are the lands where it appears that 8-story high buildings with an FSR of 3 must be permitted. On the right-hand side, similarly, this is Capilano University. We've done a similar exercise where we've drawn those circles and identified the lots where additional height and density must be permitted with a 0 parking requirement. Now, I'll mention there's a couple caveats to that parking requirement. We can still ensure that accessible parking standards are met. And certainly for any other uses within those sites other than residential, we can require parking. So if it's a commercial parking required for a commercial use. However, we are not allowed to require parking for residential uses in those two areas. So here's just a couple example images. On the left is what a 12-story structure could look like. On the right, an 8-story. Of course, that would be subject to the designs brought forward by the developer of the day, but this is just to give you an idea of scale. All right, so we're wrapping up now. And I just wanted to reiterate, we're really focused on the transit-oriented areas and the small-scale multi-unit housing conversation because we have to consider and provide advice to council, and council must consider bylaws related to creation of small-scale multi-unit housing in the district and transit-oriented area designation in the district by June 30th this year. So that's coming up very fast. Again, we'll be coming back out to the community and engaging the community on conversations around the housing needs report later this year and the interim, the updates to the official community plan and zoning bylaw that need to be in place by the end of 2025. Really appreciate everybody's attention. I know that's a lot of ground that we've covered. Happy to answer questions and really appreciate receiving your feedback today so that we can provide that to council and give council good advice on how we respond to these provincial initiatives. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And I might suggest that you keep sharing just in case some of the questions you want to go back. So, up to you how you want to handle that. We had a number of people join as Dan was speaking. So just to let everyone know, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the district's website. So by remaining in the meeting, you are implying your consent to it being recorded. And we are also taking questions in writing only. So please use the Q&A tool if you have a question. And if you're joining by phone only and don't have access to the Q&A tool, you can send your questions or comments by email to admin@lucentkey.ca. That's ADMIN at LUCENTQUAY.ca. So we have a few questions already posted, and I'll just start with the first one. The question is, the wildfire report was done in 2007 and it may be outdated. Is there any avenue for the property owner in an exempted property area to apply for an increase in housing units, Dan?
All right, so I think I still can be heard. Yes, okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the exemption area is a consideration by council. We anticipate that there will be some folks that want a change to that status in the future. And we're going to need to set up a system to respond to those requests. So this is a brand new area of regulation, and so we're just responding to it now. So we will have a process attached to it. The issue for wildfire, I would just say from my experience, is wildfire is a landscape level hazard. So it impacts broad areas, and that's really reflected in those colored areas that you saw earlier in the map. So I'll just go back to that. So there, it's important to note that the hazard is both created by a development in proximity to that forest, because you can get sparking and other things that might generate, so it can be a source of a fire, but also a risk for properties in proximity to that wildfire hazard. And we know that we're really close to large fire fuel. And we've seen from communities across Western Canada and frankly around the world that this is a really important hazard that we need to respond to. And that increasing density in areas that are subject to wildfire hazard can have significant consequences in terms of everything from evacuation to, of course, as I say, creation of fire. So it's something we take very seriously, and we want to ensure that we're applying it comprehensively, but also I would agree in terms of responding to the question. I've tried to answer it in a broad way, but we will need to create a process after June 30th to allow people to seek changes to those exemption areas. I would say, though, that certainly on an individual level, we're really talking about here like landscape level impact in the community. So that has to be part of the factor and be factored into the consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Next question is about timing. So are the servicing likely feasible lots, so as defined in your presentation, going to be approved earlier or before some of the servicing likely challenging lots?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. I mean, as you can see reflected in the maps and kind of the language we're using about more feasible, less feasible. We're still learning. We're still analyzing the information coming in, and a lot of our advice is going to depend upon, at the end of the day, what is approved and where those units are approved. I think what we also want to have is a strategy about how to finance those infrastructure improvements, and one of the tools is development cost charges. So we'll be looking carefully at the development potential in these areas and trying to understand where we might see conversion. Because remember, I mentioned we're not going to see this all change overnight. So it could happen in a very spotty fashion, a spread out fashion, or it could be concentrated in certain areas of the community. We don't quite know the answer to those questions. And those kinds of questions are important for us to understand how we're going to finance and pay for this infrastructure to accommodate this growth, because we know that in particular those blue areas, those areas where it's going to be likely challenging to service, those costs could be very significant. So we need to do a little bit more research analysis there to really give good advice to our council. But we are going to have to update various bylaws like the development cost charge bylaw in order to ensure that we have the resources in place to make those changes. And in the meantime, there might be some sites, if it's really a constrained site in terms of servicing, where the servicing just can't reasonably be accommodated in the short term. However, we could see change over time. So probably not the exact answer you're looking for in terms of specifically, I can say it's going to be able to be developed based on servicing. We're going to have to do a little more research in order to give really good advice to our council about how to achieve servicing, especially in those blue areas where we know there are some significant constraints on water and sanitary sewer services. Thanks. I don't know, Andy, did you want to add any more to that question? Because you're the engineer, you deal with this every day and understand the kinds of challenges that can come with creating increased density in these areas that were originally built for single family.
Dan, thank you. I don't have a lot to add to it other than servicing for just one extra property in one area can be a problem if we cannot deliver the services required to meet the engineering standards for that one extra property, whereas in other areas it might not be. A different service might mean that we do not have a concern with just the one property, but it's more of a neighborhood concern. So it is complex. We are doing modeling to try and figure out how we can accommodate extra density in both the blue and the green areas. Thank you.
That's good. And as you heard, probably an important message coming out of this is the green areas where servicing is likely feasible. That's probably where we want to encourage change, encourage density and growth. The areas where there are more constraints, that's where we might think about, well, how can we appropriately affect that change over time and make sure that we can address the logical extension of services. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. This question is in regard to the housing report. The question is, what does density benefits only for house that exceeds needs mean? So that is actually a quote from that slide. And what does the exception for one unit mean?
Sure.
Maybe we could go to that slide.
Yeah. Okay, so I passed over that relatively, I think this is the, I want to make sure. There we go, limited density bonus in the power. All right, so we use a tool called density bonus zoning in order to create a base density in zoning that people can build to, or a higher density if they provide some amenities or features that are looked upon as needed in the community, such as affordable housing. So this is a common tool we use often at the time of rezoning, and we create a bylaw that has those two levels of density, and the higher level density comes with essentially greater density, but also a requirement, say, for affordability of some of the units. So what the province has done in the in Bill 44 that was approved at the end of November is that they actually stripped away that power for small scale multi-unit housing. So we wouldn't be able to negotiate for density bonusing, except for the 6th unit. We could theoretically create a density bonusing rule that would allow us to bonus the 6th unit. Limited applicability, I think, for the District North Vancouver, an opportunity. Likewise, the province also stripped away our ability to use density bonus zoning in order to achieve the 20 years of growth anticipated in the Housing Needs Report. Interestingly, and I don't want to get into much detail because we don't know a whole lot yet, but the legislation Bill 16 introduced last week actually changed those powers again. And they've introduced a concept called inclusionary zoning. We're looking carefully at those rules to see how that could maybe help us achieve some affordable units in the community. And we'll be providing more advice to council in the future as we pour into that legislation. It's not been adopted yet. It's just at first reading in the provincial legislature. So more to be heard on that zoning change. And hopefully it will help us address some of the needs for affordability in our community. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. The next question is, what are the proposed parking requirements for 4-unit lots? I know you talked briefly about parking, but maybe you can speak specifically to this question.
Sure. Well, it's an area of ongoing conversation. The province has indicated in their policy guide that council must consider. It doesn't mean we have to apply this, but council must consider. They talked about the need for, and I'm just looking at the provincial policy document here, for those 4-unit sites, which I believe was the question, a range of 0.5 or 1 space per unit is the policy guidance from the province. Okay, so I'm happy to hear folks' thoughts on whether they think that's sufficient. What the province is suggesting by way of policy will meet the needs of district residents. Because we do need to come back and give council advice on that by June 30th. But that's the range that the province has provided in policy.
Thanks, Dan. We just had a few more people join, so I just want to let everyone know we're taking questions in writing due to the size of the participants. And so if you can use the Q&A tool to please ask your questions. This next question is about the building guidelines, and it's fairly lengthy, but I'll try and be as brief as possible. Is the district able to apply additional building guidelines on small-scale multi-unit housing developments with respect to stormwater management? And specifically, can DNV demand best practices with respect to rainwater management, permeable surfaces, groundwater management, those kinds of things? Just because the concern is around that the district uses creeks for municipal stormwater management, and the habitat of those creeks in this person's question suggests that they've been degraded from the current density of development and proximity of buildings and trees to those creeks.
So many of my colleagues and ourselves have put this question to the province as well as we try to understand how small-scale multi-unit housing applies. And what the province has indicated that yes, local standards, they get more concerned if those standards somehow limit the density potential of the site. So to go to 4 to 6 units, that would raise alarm bells in the province's mind. However, the district really has an important obligation to ensure that sites can be serviced. And we want to make sure that our utility and servicing bylaws are written in such a way that we can ensure that the on-site infrastructure, such as stormwater, can appropriately manage the flows that are anticipated, even with 4 to 6 units. And there's often engineering solutions for these ideas in terms of detention and retention of water, but not every site can, be fully developed if there is significant impervious area. Those paved areas, those roof areas can generate a lot of water. And so the province has said, yes, we can still regulate in that area, but they're going to be monitoring it carefully to see if it negatively impacts the density potential within small-scale multi-unit housing. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. This one is a little bit similar in terms of where there might need to be upgrades made. This person would say, can I actually apply to put a fourplex in on like July 1st, 2024? And if it's one of those areas where the servicing is challenged, how might the need for service upgrades stall some of those building permits or require that they take longer?
Yeah, so I'll probably tip to Andy here as well, but just from our perspective, yes, we need to have the systems in place that if council has identified by bylaw, you know, those 4 and 6 unit small scale multi-unit housing areas, that we are able to receive and process building permit applications. It's an outstanding question whether or not there will be a development permit also required. So that would be a precondition of building permit. We will be having a conversation with council about that. And what a development permit is really typically looks at the form and character, the aesthetic of the development. So we haven't had that direction from council yet as to whether or not we will have a development permit process associated with small scale multi-unit housing. That's to be determined. But definitely we need to be prepared to respond to those types of applications when they do come in on July 1st and all the days thereafter. And servicing, what we want to try to do is, as much as possible, is provide clarity around what is required to meet minimum safety standards and servicing standards. An example that springs to mind is the fire flow. So water, volume, and pressure needs to be at a certain level in order to accommodate the increased density. So, of course, we model sites on a regular basis. We look at sites in response to development proposals, and we make that determination at that time. Then the question arises, if the site can't, doesn't have the fire flow necessary to be safe, then what upgrades are needed in order to achieve that, and at what cost? Is that a significant cost that really is just too much that can't be borne by one site and needs to be done on a neighborhood level, or is it something that's relatively modest? That would have to be answered at that time. But that gives you an idea of the kind of thinking that we put behind those kinds of issues. We want to set up clear standards for people that need to be achieved. We want to model it to confirm whether or not it can be achieved, and then give you a good idea about whether or not what those costs might look like. And that's in concert with the design engineer that's hired by the developer. So, Andy, did you want to add any more? I've just given a pretty high level overview. Or Peter, sorry.
A couple of things. Obviously, at this time, we have not brought forward bylaws to determine exactly where exemptions will apply, for example. So we are still in the process of completing our hydraulic modeling to determining where we do have servicing restrictions. So that's going to be ongoing for a while. But as Dan speaks to, we're obviously preparing to be able to accept applications as soon as possible. Also, just to speak very briefly to the last point about integrated stormwater management planning, the district already does require single-family redevelopments to create on-site stormwater management plans and to implement on-site stormwater management structures, which could be as simple as a rain garden if your engineer can indicate that rain garden can accommodate the requirements of it per the development servicing bylaw. And of course, we are looking at what other servicing requirements are needed for this kind of extra density. For example, we don't have sidewalks in many neighborhoods, but we know that as we densify our neighborhoods, that not everyone may have a car. And certainly the province is stating that for 6-unit houses, properties, then we cannot require parking, which really puts the emphasis on transit. It puts the emphasis on sidewalks, being able to get around. So we need to determine what servicing requirements are needed for these new forms of density. Thank you, Dan.
That's a good segue to the next question, Andy. And maybe we could go to the slide that shows the transit-oriented areas. The comment and the question is that the province has expanded the definition of transit-oriented areas to include bus stops. So the question is, which bus stops are going to be included in the DNV zoning?
Sure. So what I understand is the province gave itself the power to, by regulation, define where transit-oriented areas are. And the two areas that I'm aware of, unless one of the folks on the call can correct me, the two areas that I'm aware of are Phipps Exchange and Capilano University. And those are the two that have been defined in regulation. So there might be a change in some definitions about bus stops, but these are the, I believe they're called bus exchanges in the regulation. So these are the two that I understand apply. You raise a good point, though, that the province can always expand the amount of transit-oriented areas simply by regulation. So the minister could, and cabinet could establish a regulation and be enacted, and that would create more transit-oriented areas. I would hope that would be tied to improved transit service levels, so increased investment in transit infrastructure. I think that's definitely needed on the North Shore, needed in the District of North Vancouver, and would be my advice. That would be an important precursor to increasing the amount of transit-oriented areas in the community. Thanks.
And on the same vein of transit, how close in proximity to frequent transit for that 15-minute interval on Saturdays from 10 to 6 do you need to be in order to qualify for 6 units?
Yeah, so just moving to that map. So the map that shows the areas in red. So the areas in red were defined with because the province created a definition for frequent transit stops. And what we did is we took their definition and we applied it to the transit routes in the District of North Vancouver. And this is our understanding of where the frequent transit areas are. And then the outline is shown in, a little hard to see, but it's kind of a dashed blue line. That's the extent of the polygon that's created around those frequent transit stops. And therefore, it appears from the provincial legislation that small-scale multi-unit housing for up to 6 units would apply within those red areas. So this is our assessment of the regulation at this time and where 6 unit would otherwise apply unless exempted by one of those exemptions I mentioned earlier.
Thanks,
Okay.
Dan. The next question actually is one I know I can answer. The question is, will we be able to get a copy of the presentation? So this presentation is being taped, and it will be available on the website, as well as the display boards that are being prepared for the open houses in the next day or so. The next question is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Mention one more thing. I think we're also going to be adding, I believe, Andy, this map in particular that's shown on the screen on the Geo Tools or GeoWeb site that the district has, so that the members of the public can go and look and you know, it's fully scalable, so you can zoom right down into the parcels and see which SSMU area applies to your parcel or if it's exempt. Andy, I believe we're going to have that up soon, I hope.
Yes, to clarify, we have not actually put this map onto GeoWeb. What we have done is we have gone onto every property and identified the maximum possible number of units permitted under the provincial regulation. So if you see your house is in the yellow zone here, you will be able to go to the you will be able to go to your house. You will click on your house, and all of the property information attributes will come up. Under the regulatory attribute where you see your zoning, which for example could be RS4, single family residential zoning, just in that section you will now see proposed zoning for small scale multi-unit housing, and it will say up to 4 units. You can click on up to 4 units, and that will take you to a PDF document that provides some more background about what we've discussed today and some additional notes on that zoning.
Excellent. And the optimal word being proposed. So these aren't final zoning and in place yet. This is a conversation that hasn't occurred yet. But what this is the best available information we have at this time to understand where they could apply. And again, that's subject to bylaws that would need to be considered by council before June 30th. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan and Andy. The next question is actually a good segue again. So when will the draft bylaws be available for the public?
Good question, Andy. What's our timeline? We're doing engagement in the coming weeks, and then we'll return bylaws to council in advance of council's consideration in June. I'm not sure if you've got a specific deadline which they'd be publicly available yet.
I don't think we have a specific deadline. We do intend to be bringing bylaws forward in early June so that we can achieve the deadline set by the province of June 30th.
Thanks both. We have a couple of questions around rental versus strata. And so one question is, will there be any incentives for rental housing? And is there, how will you determine, can they be stratified if they're sixplex, threeplex, those kinds of things?
Yeah. So the provincial legislation that was put in place for small scale multi-unit housing and actually transit-oriented areas was silent on tenure. So, and by tenure, I mean an owner lives in the property or a renter occupies the property. And because it was silent, that meant local governments could continue to regulate in this area. So for the last, just to give you some context, for the last few years, local governments have been allowed to actually zone, not just for land use, but also for tenure. So we can create zones where rental tenure or tenants occupying the units is required under zoning. And I think it's a really important question that we're all asking ourselves is how many rental units do we need in the future? The province says we need about 54% of all net new units to be rental in order to meet the needs of the community. They advised us of that in October this year. And so we know that as we create increased density, both in small scale multi-unit housing and transit-oriented areas, that a big chunk of that should be rental. And so the opportunity before us is, and a decision that council will need to take is whether or not to apply rental tenure zoning to some or all of these small scale multi-unit housing areas or transit-oriented areas. What that could mean, and there's a lot of control, and I won't go in at length, but what that could mean is, say, if you had a 4-unit site, the first unit could be occupied by an owner, and then the rest of the units would need to be occupied by renters. That's an example of the kind of regulation that can get created to encourage rental tenure in the community. But I'm happy to receive feedback from folks on what they think, if they think that's an important thing that the district should be applying, or if the district should stay away from it for some reason and just allow these units to be stratified and sold as individual real estate entities. I think it's an important question, and I look forward to hearing people's feedback and providing council some advice. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Just doing a bit of a time check here. We have 3 minutes left in the scheduled time. Dan indicated that we could go a little bit longer and I appreciate that not everyone has that flexibility. So I'm trying to group as many different questions together as possible. But just a reminder to all that this session is being recorded. It will be available. And we will be looking at posting the themes of all the questions that were asked. And again, there's also opportunity to attend the open houses. The next questions we have, there's quite a few around like specific FSR requirements, and then linked to some of those are around, well, can we provide underground parking? Will they allowed to have full basements? Those kinds of things. So maybe you could address FSR generally, and it would answer a few of these questions.
Sure. I believe that the provincial policies for small scale multi-unit housing don't necessarily recommend that there be FSR rates for SSMUs, for SMUs. However, that's just a policy guidance. It's been our practice in the past that single family and infill zones do have an FSR limit within them. And that the opportunity is there, I think, for us to have an FSR limit. And that's in addition to, height and setbacks and all those other kind of rules that you typically see with zones. FSR creates a limit in terms of total floor area. So you add all the floors together and what's the total floor allowance. As I say, the provincial policy doesn't provide particular guidance, but staff are analyzing the height that the province is recommending of 11 meters and 3 stories, and looking at the typical lots in the district. And we will be providing council with some advice about FSR and site coverage regulations as part of the SSMU or SMU zones. But we want to make sure that it's practical, that it can accommodate those 4 to 6 units if that's indeed what the zoning permits. We will be providing advice to council. So I don't have answers for you specifically today on an FSR amount, but we will be happy to receive input if folks have an amount they think is reasonable, if they've had a look at the provincial policies or they've seen something work really well in another community. Happy to hear about that, and we'll be providing council some advice before the end of June on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Just want to acknowledge if those folks who have to leave at 1, just thank you so much for participating. We're going to keep going with a few more questions to try and answer as many as we can. Thanks so much to everyone for joining and for your patience as we respond to the questions. Next question is back to the comments around likely challenging. And this question is there any way for someone to find, get more information, a property owner to understand what likely challenging might mean on their property?
And that's where I might go to Andy. I think, like I say, at this stage, because we're dealing with trying to respond to these very broad policy conversations at council, that we don't really, to be frank, we don't have the bandwidth to go to every site in the community right now and assess its service capacity on a site-by-site basis. So if say, every person who was interested in small-scale multifamily housing decided to give us a call tomorrow and ask us, hey, can you model the system to see if my particular property can be serviced for water, sanitary, storm, and transportation reasons, we just are not going to have the ability to assess every site on a site-by-site basis. We're going to have to look at things on a broad brush and policy level and come back with, once we learn more, because we have such a limited time frame here to respond to this issue. As we learn more, we're going to be providing advice to council on infrastructure improvements and how to fund that. But at this stage, don't have the ability to really go into the high level of detail and specifics on a site-by-site basis. Andy, I don't know if you wanted to add any more.
Yeah, just really, we can't answer that question at this time, and it's for multiple reasons. As Dan said, we don't have the bandwidth right now. There's a lot of background work involved in understanding the legislation, the implications of the legislation, modeling the impacts, et cetera, et cetera. So staff's time is really spent focused on that rather than answering individual inquiries. And as I mentioned earlier on, until we actually make a decision on exactly where the zoning will be applied, then we don't have the modeling inputs that we need to actually be able to answer that question. We are, of course, aware of the uncertainty that this brings for lot owners, and we will be trying to bring forward information as soon as we can to answer that question. But I do not anticipate that will be until bylaws are introduced. So kind of in the July timeframe.
Thanks both. Back to a question around the transit-oriented areas. And I guess first a comment and then a question. So the question or the comment around the transit-oriented area at Capilano University, the comment is that it doesn't really make sense because it's not walkable per se. There's steep embankments to reach the transit exchange. So, is there any consideration of, it's not just as the crow flies, you have to actually think about the infrastructure to get there. And then the second question is around the FIBS exchange. And really, given that was already part of the district's plans, are there any plans to actually allow increased, like more than the designated density?
Yeah. Good, and I'll say we're learning more as we analyze this, both from a legal perspective as well as community perspective. But the transit-oriented area allowance of a certain amount of height and density, either, as I mentioned in the presentation, the province has said that we can't refuse rezonings only for the reason of height and density allowed under this regulation. Okay, so what they're basically signaling is there might be other very good reasons why development of that density could not be accommodated. Maybe there's a hazardous condition that applies to the property. I think the question provider said steep slopes, right? So there might be a steep slope impact into that area. The province has said that those types of issues are still in the realm of consideration. I think what they're suggesting is that density should be accommodated if possible. And again, this is highly constrained though in the regulation and in the legislation. There's a real limit on the tools we can use to try to limit density, both in terms of small scale multi-unit housing and transit-oriented areas. It reminds me of a question, we raised the same question, some of our counterparts in the metro region, some of these transit-oriented area circles cross rivers, go into a neighboring jurisdiction, or only touch a property very slightly, say at the corner of a property, and yet the whole property enjoys the benefit, will and does now enjoy the benefit of higher density. All of those questions were put to the province, and the province said, well, it is what it is. This is how the regulation applies. And there isn't the ability to kind of, the province is not going to go back and refine these circles from what we understand to try to account for or respond to those physical limitation issues. I think they're just suggesting the local governments use their powers to try to limit areas where appropriate, while ensuring that if the only reason why we're refusing is height and density, that's not a good reason, is essentially what they're saying, but there might be other reasons why it should be refused. I
Thanks,
don't know
Dan.
if that's the second half of that question. I think I was focused on the first half.
It was more around, would you allow more than the minimum density in the FIBS exchange? Are you looking to go higher?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Probably not by June, because I think we're really focused on how do we just accommodate what the province is saying required must be done. But I think that's a very, very useful conversation as part of the official community plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment changes that are required by the end of 2025. Because if, as you can imagine, if we have 20 years worth of zoned capacity in the community and we're trying to allocate that amongst the existing development sites in the community, we're going to be looking quite carefully at height and density in proximity to transit. That is a big part of, will be a big part of our focus, and we'll be engaging the community at that time on those issues. And I think that's in the realm of possibility, is to look at additional height in order to accommodate it, because you either go up or you go spread out. Those are sort of two ways to put the density in the community, and going up in appropriate locations can make some sense, and we'll be engaging with the community at that time, starting after June and all the way up into the end of 2025.
Thanks, Dan. We have a couple of questions around form and character for the small scale multi-unit housing. So some questions around, is that going to change the setbacks? Another question was, are you allowed to have multiple buildings on one site, or does it all have to be in the same? Another question around, like, can they be laneway housing, those kinds of things? So could you speak generally to that form and character?
Yeah, we think what the provincial policy documents refer to is create as much flexibility as possible is what they're suggesting. And there are some suggested changes to setbacks. They're in the policy document itself, and it depends upon the number of units in the project. And they've got some, and just looking at the setback recommendations, that they range from 4 to 6 meters down to 2 meters for front yards, approximately 1.5 meters for side yards, and so on. So they've got some guidance. Feel free to have a look at the provincial policy document online. We don't have exact numbers to share today, but we will be looking carefully at these provincial guidelines and then proposing small scale multi-unit housing setbacks. Yes, I would agree that we need to be able to accommodate various configurations, not just one large block building, but potentially 2 buildings or multiple buildings on a site, because flexibility will be the key here, certainly on sites in the district where we are challenged with topography and other issues, that the regulations need to be able to, I think, accommodate those kinds of opportunities that the question asker suggested.
Thanks, Dan. We have, I think it's maybe some more questions for clarification around strata and ownership. And so just for clarification, can they be stratified? Do they have to be stratified? And does each unit then have its own property identification number?
Yeah. So right now, a single family home with a suite, that cannot be stratified, okay? And that's because a single family home is defined as one real estate entity under the BC Building Code. In the future world of small scale multi-unit housing that's being required by the province, The opportunity is before council to decide whether to allow those small-scale multi-unit housing units to be stratified. So the question hasn't been answered yet. We're going to be providing advice to council on that. I'd be happy to hear from members of the public if they would like to see that opportunity of stratification, or if they're concerned with it. If they're concerned with the stratification of multiple units on a site, happy to hear feedback either way. I think you know, we have heard from some developers that stratification increases the likelihood of redevelopment of a site, because as you can imagine, if you can buy one lot and then make more money by stratifying it and selling off each individual unit, if you can make more money doing that, that would make sense, you know, for a developer who's looking to make money. The question was, can you do it? Potentially, unless council were to apply rental tenure zoning on the property, and then that would then prohibit stratification and require that the tenants be renters, okay, other than maybe one being the owner. I think I've kind of talked around the question. We don't have an answer yet because it's an outstanding question for council to decide on. But if the question asker has a preference one way or another, happy to hear that kind of feedback.
Great, thanks, Dan. And just a time check again, we'll end at 1:15, so we'll try and answer as many as the remaining questions as we can in that time frame. This one is a question, again, more about timing. Will demolition permits be issued for prospective 3, 4, and 6 unit builds before the new build is approved, given that it would be subject to upcoming June 30th requirements? It sounds quite specific, but I guess it's sort of that piece of, is everything on pause right now, or are things continuing to move forward?
No, a demolition permit actually isn't subject to what's going to happen in the future. Any owner can just come in and apply for a demolition permit. If the site is on the heritage register, in the past, we've taken those requests, we've held that demolition permit, and we've taken that requested redevelopment to council for consideration about whether or not that heritage site has enough value and character, therefore it needs some kind of protection in the future. But for all other properties that don't have a heritage, that aren't on the heritage register or aren't protected, we receive and process demolition permit applications as we're required to, which is anyone may come in and apply to demolish an existing building. And we, of course, have some, basic safety requirements that have to be met, such as disconnection of services, and also, submission of securities to guarantee that if there's any damage to the curb, that's rectified and things like that. So we have conditions attached to the issuance of permits, but they're not attached to whether or not a council may approve small-scale multifamily housing or not in the future. That wouldn't be a consideration in our mind when we're assessing that demolition permit if it were to be submitted today.
Dan, we have a number of comments and questions, concerned around the speed with which some of this legislation is moving forward, and some people are suggesting that there hasn't been enough consultation. Maybe you could speak to what is the district doing in terms of when you look to OCP amendments, those kinds of things, beyond the in order to implement the things that you're doing. Is there any sort of future consultation planned as part of any of those activities?
Yeah, and so we have some very targeted, very specific information sharing and discussion going on right now related to this topic, because as you can imagine, the provincial legislation came out in late fall, and then they published policy guidance and so on in the spring. And so we've had very little time, frankly, from my perspective, to be able to respond to these really significant changes. And I think that's how our council feels and how the community feels as well, that it's happening quite quickly. And that's certainly a challenge, given that, there are some folks who just have not necessarily even heard about these potential changes. I know the Minister Ravi Kahlon and the Premier have tried to publish press releases and information and try to get the word out. But there's been so many different changes going on in this area, and I mentioned a few of them earlier in the presentation, that there's quite a lot of activity in it, and we recognize it's quite challenging for residents. So we're trying to do our best right now to get information out to make sure that as many people as possible, anyone with an interest, has an opportunity to see what the provincial rules are, how they're changing, and how it might impact the district, and to get that feedback so that we can respond to the very tight timelines the province has given us to respond, which is June 30th for transit-oriented areas and small-scale multifamily housing. And I think, Pam, you mentioned that the broader conversation around changes to the housing needs report, official community plan, and zoning bylaw, we're going to have a little more time to implement those over the coming months and years, up to the end of 2025. And we really think that is a really fundamental time for discussing these big issues with the community, how to allocate density. An important conversation occurred back to create the 2011 OCP, and we want to make sure that we have an equally robust conversation with the community about what the next coming 20 years is going to look like. So yes, there will be much more engagement related to that. But between now and June 30th, we're quite constrained for time. We're going to do everything we can to make sure to get the information out. I know this is the first, and we have a number of meetings coming up in person and virtual that will be sharing this information and spreading the word, and certainly appreciate everyone who's attending today to spread the word as well, and certainly happy to answer questions as we go along.
Thanks so much. It is 1:15, so that is all the time that we have for questions today. I just want to acknowledge the comments that were received. Everything that is questions and comments will form part of the public record. So thank you all for taking the time to ask your questions and to write down your comments. We will unfortunately we didn't get the chance to get to all of them, but we got pretty close. So please do rest assured that everything will form part of the public engagement record. This presentation, as I mentioned earlier, has been recorded and it will be available on the website. So you can learn more by visiting the district's website, dnv.org/housing-legislation. That's where you can also fill out the online survey. And then if you have a more specific question or you want to provide additional information, the email address is planning@dnv.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We are adjourned.